Good morning, Dr. Chris Baker. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. With a short introduction, Dr. Chris Baker is Goldsmiths University of London Professor of Religion, Belief and Public Life. He has done a lot of research and published on the visible role and impact of religion and belief on public life and its political, social, economic, urban, policy and theological implications at both the global and the local levels. Professor Chris Baker has also researched and published several articles on spiritual capital and its policy implications. So thank you so much, Professor Chris Baker, for joining us this morning. We would like to have a brief conversation with you on this topic of spiritual capital for our upcoming learning series that you've kindly agreed to participate in, which we've been running through SCMLI. So just a couple of questions to really understand better what your take is on spiritual capital and what your conversation is going to be about. How did you first become aware of this notion of spiritual capital? Can you share that with us?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. So spiritual capital emerged for me, I don't know, about 20 years ago. In my first kind of area of research after I got my doctorate. And my area of research then and still is really the relationship between religion and spirituality and the built environment, so urban planning, urban development. As the world becomes more urbanized, to everyone's surprise, the world isn't becoming less religious, it's becoming, you know, as religious as it ever was. So there isn't necessarily a break between urbanism and modernity and religious and spiritual practice. So I was very interested in how religion and spirituality kind of inform the way that cities develop. And I did a project looking at urban regeneration in Manchester, a city in the north of England, a post-industrial city then. And a lot of services had been withdrawn, and I was interested in how faith groups were stepping in to provide basic goods and services. But more than that, a kind of sense of hope and transformation as well in very deprived and marginalized urban communities. And it was very easy to, you know, research what they offered. They offered a huge range of services, you know, youth clubs, social clubs, education facilities, lots and lots of social care. And the local authority and the government were very, very keen to have that because they were keen to regenerate these urban areas. But a missing part of the dimension from the policy point of view was the motivation, it was the why. And when you can't speak to faith groups and people inspired by their religion and spirituality, they can't separate what they do from why they do. And it became very obvious to me that in policy terms, a recurring story and motif from all these faith groups, so I looked across all faith traditions, and why they were doing and what they were doing for urban regeneration. They all said, it always feels like we have to leave something very important about ourselves at the door whenever we want to talk about, you know, partnerships or what we can offer to, you know, in terms of resources. So we're always asked to leave our motivation at the door. And if we're asked to do that, it feels like, you know, we're being asked to obscure something that's really important to us. We're not allowed to be authentically ourselves in this meeting. And that's when I came up with the term spiritual capital, because these goods and services that they were providing would not be possible without the motivation they derived from their values and their beliefs and their traditions.
Right.
And so I said to policymakers at the time, you can't create a policy environment where these things are left out of the room. You're going to get so much more out of partnerships and working alongside people if you allow them to bring into the space their values and beliefs and their worldviews, because that's what's bringing them into that space in the first place.
Interesting. So why wasn't faith religion and spirituality, the terminology, those terms, why wasn't that enough? What does spiritual capital as a concept add?
I think what the term capital adds is it kind of breaks that binary that's breaking down, but it's still there, that somehow religion is private, and you can't bring religion into the public square, you can't bring religion into decision making because it's perceived to be partisan or irrational in some way. So what capital does is it allows you to bring religion and faith into the public square, because then it engages with other forms of capital that people realize, like social capital, human capital, economic capital. So although people have rightly critiqued the idea of capital, sometimes saying, well, is it fair, is it appropriate to bring the word capital alongside spiritual? Because, you're functionalizing something, you're instrumentalizing something that's magical, it's mystical. Nevertheless, empirical data I've done and many other people have done is that spiritual capital, i.e. that motivation for doing something, is integral to most other forms of capital. You wouldn't have human capital, you wouldn't have social capital, you wouldn't have economic capital even unless people were bringing in their motivations and their values and beliefs. So what I think the capital language, although it's not 100% accurate maybe or right, it nevertheless does bring it into the public sphere, because it allows you to have the conversation about how faith and religion intersect with other public goods in a way and in a language that other people understand.
Interesting. So are there any specific policy areas where you've been successful in getting this idea across, or where this is particularly relevant, where you've seen success, so to speak, in terms of presenting this notion in such a way and it unlocking maybe values or conversations that otherwise would not have been accessible?
Yes, I mean, I think the conversation that I started 20 years ago with policymakers and local authorities has slowly been bearing fruit. And within the context of the UK, the last 10 years, we've seen the policy of austerity. We've seen, therefore, the re-emergence of faith-based social care and welfare, because local authorities in the UK have had their budgets cut by 30-40% in that period. So people have started again to notice the usefulness of faith and its positive and progressive contributions that it makes to society. So we're now ready to have the conversation about, well, how do we develop these partnerships so that they're more resilient, they're more sustainable? And a big impetus for that clearly has been the pandemic in the last 2 years. And I've been commissioned by a parliamentary group in the UK, the all-party parliamentary group on faith and society. I was asked to do some research a year ago, looking at the first 6 months of the pandemic, the experience of lockdown and that first wave of the pandemic, and the partnerships that emerged from that between faith groups and local authorities. And it was very clear that local authorities had a reawakened sense of appreciation and valuing the role of religion, the role of faith in their communities. I think it had always been there, but the pandemic had really kind of turbocharged that appreciation and understanding. And because there was such a crisis to be faced, the kind of partnerships that evolved were at a much deeper level. People had to kind of really understand each other. You couldn't just sort of, go on tried and tested hierarchies and kind of traditional partnerships. You really had to say, yeah, this is what I can offer, and this is why I want to offer it. And so the relationship went to a much deeper level straight away, because people were having to innovate, they were having to, really get down to the kind of what are the resources that we offer. So I think the idea of spiritual capital, since then, I'm now doing some follow-up research to that. It's very clear that what people valued out of that partnership was the opportunity to share values, because out of shared values comes shared outcomes. Out of shared values becomes a greater trust, better communication, more innovative planning, more sustainable planning, a more honest conversation, a more authentic conversation. And instead of people seeing this as a luxury, now people say this is integral to what people are calling a new normal. How can we create deeper, more sustainable partnerships, not just between local authorities and faith groups, but actually everywhere? And fundamental to that deeper relationship that builds up relational capital, that builds up innovation, that builds up new thinking, new mindsets, culture shifts, is the centrality of sharing values and understanding motivation. So I'm seeing spiritual capital now really having a real renewed engagement with people. And sometimes I call it spiritual capital, sometimes I call it beliefs, values, and worldviews. But people get the idea of sharing values and beliefs, because we need to, that's the kind of deeper moral, ethical level that we're now being called to form relationships that then sustain innovation. The money question comes at the end almost. Yes. The problem with the old system of partnerships is that you began with the money, and then that immediately caused competition and mistrust. Yes. We're moving towards a values-based economy, I think, in the UK, and certainly in terms of policy making. And the financial capital is important, but it comes in the context of what is the problem? What are the resources that we've got? What are the motivations, the deep motivations and values that we bring to problem solving this deep issue? And the deep issues at the moment are clearly the pandemic, climate emergency, growing social and economic inequality.
Wonderful. Well, that sounds very informative. I'm very much looking forward to having a deeper conversation on these topics soon with you when you're going to be presenting on December the 14th. So thank you so much for that brief introduction. We hope that people are going to enjoy it and that they'll join us for your event. We very much look forward to it.
Thank you, Alan. I'm looking forward to it as well. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.